1944. World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy,
the water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
To the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
September 1944. The Western Allies were closing in on the German heartland. But now, the formidable defences of the Siegfried Line stood in their path. So the Allies came up with a daring plan to bypass the German defences and cross the River Rhine in a single bound, with the largest deployment of airborne infantry ever seen.
We all knew that Market Garden was a very big deal from the moment we saw the airborne going overhead.
But the elite Allied soldiers sent into battle soon discovered the plan was badly flawed.
It was a disaster, from beginning to end.
And that it was never wise to underestimate the German army.
You was in for a fight. No two ways about it.
There were an awful lot of Germans in the Netherlands, and we found them.
This is the story of Operation Market Garden. The D-Day landings of June 1944 had been followed by weeks of grueling fighting in Normandy. But finally, the Western Allies had forced the German army into headlong retreat. German losses were enormous. 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, as well as thousands of vehicles and heavy weapons destroyed. That September, the German army was still desperately trying to rebuild its forces in the West and preparing for a final battle to defend Germany itself. But just at the moment the Germans seemed beaten, the Allies were running into their own difficulties.
In September 1944, the Allies were suffering a severe supply shortage because their supplies still had to be brought to the front line from the Normandy beaches. The Germans knew about this, and they knew that the Allied advance had slowed down mainly because of a lack of supplies.
What the Allies needed to solve their supply crisis was a channel port, but they were either still in German hands or, like Cherbourg, had been comprehensively sabotaged by the Germans before their liberation. The Allied supply lines were now 300 miles long and could no longer deliver enough fuel and ammunition to frontline units to sustain the pace of the advance. But British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a bold plan, one which he believed would allow the Allies to sidestep the supply crisis and end the war by Christmas 1944. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, or Monty, had commanded all Allied land forces during the D-Day landings and the Normandy campaign. But now US troops outnumbered British and Canadian. It was no longer politically acceptable for a British general to command them. So Churchill had promoted Monty to Field Marshal, while he was effectively demoted to command the mostly British and Canadian 21st Army Group. Allied intelligence reports indicated that the Germans' northern flank, opposite 21st Army Group, was lightly defended. So Monty proposed that his force attack north from Belgium into the Netherlands, bypassing Germany's strongest defences along the Siegfried Line, to encircle Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr Valley and pave the way for a direct advance on Berlin. He named his plan Operation Market Garden. But Monty would have to sell the plan to the Supreme Allied Commander, American General Dwight Eisenhower, who had his own plan for the advance.
Eisenhower was content, for political reasons and for alliance reasons, to keep the advance more or less even across the front. This is the so-called broad front advance, that everybody would share the risks and share the achievements. This is very much Eisenhower's style, but there simply weren't enough resources for this. What Montgomery wanted was to divert the resources to a northern arm, the so-called narrow front attack. And he believed that if this was done, then he could get through to the Ruhr early enough to end the war in a matter of months.
But if Monty was going to get extra supplies for Operation Market Garden, someone else would have to lose out.
The personal politics of Market Garden are also quite fascinating. Montgomery lobbied Eisenhower ruthlessly and without end to carry out this operation. Montgomery knew that any resources given to him would be taken away from the Americans like Patton farther south, and he lobbied Eisenhower until Eisenhower finally gave in and gave Montgomery his pet airborne operation.
Montgomery got his supplies, as well as use of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, an elite force of 40,000 British, American and Polish soldiers, ready to be dropped behind enemy lines by parachute and glider. Montgomery made these troops the cornerstone of a bold, ambitious plan that required clockwork precision. British 30th Corps was to advance 64 miles along a single road from the Belgian border to the Dutch town of Arnhem, but their route crossed several rivers and canals, including 2 major branches of the lower Rhine. So 3 Allied airborne divisions would drop ahead of the ground forces to seize key bridges along the route, including 2 major bridges over the lower Rhine at Nijmegen and Arnhem, before the Germans could destroy them or organize their defense. The bridges were well defended by anti-aircraft guns to ward off Allied bombers, so the airborne troops were to land several miles from their targets and complete their approach on foot. The airborne assault was codenamed Market, the ground attack, Garden. The spearhead of Lieutenant General Horrock's 30th Corps was the Guards Armoured Division, with 268 tanks, mostly Shermans. They'd be supported by the 43rd Wessex and 50th Northumbrian Infantry Divisions, tanks of the 8th Armoured Brigade and Royal Engineer bridging units. Airborne troops were under the command of Lieutenant General Browning's British 1st Airborne Corps, made up of British 1st Airborne Division, a Polish parachute brigade, and 2 US divisions attached for the operation, the 82nd and 101st Airborne. The Royal Air Force and US Army Air Force would provide 1,500 transport aircraft and 500 gliders to get troops to their targets. Lieutenant General Boy Browning, commanding the Allied airborne troops, was Britain's senior airborne officer, married to the famous novelist Daphne du Maurier. Seen by some as difficult to work with, relations with his American boss, 1st Allied Airborne Army Commander Lieutenant General Brereton, were particularly strained. In the run-up to the operation, reports arrived that German SS Panzer units had been seen near Arnhem, the British airborne objective. A British intelligence officer took the reports to Browning.
The Corps intelligence officer, a chap called Van Urquhart, he warned us that there were 2 SS Panzer divisions lined up from Arnhem to Zutphen, and that he had warned General Browning about this. And he said Browning's plan for the operation would fail unless he altered them to take account of these 2 divisions. And Browning had told him that he was not to tell any of us about it, and that he did not believe that the tanks really were operable because they'd just been fighting in the Normandy.
If there were German panzer units near Arnhem, the entire operation would probably be called off. And Browning and many others in the elite Airborne Corps were determined to press ahead. The Netherlands had fallen to German blitzkrieg in May 1940, but since then the country had remained relatively unscathed by global war.
Das war wie Friedenszeiten. In Holland schien die Welt für uns noch in Ordnung. Das lag einmal daran, dass die Wetterbedingungen hervorragend waren. Wir hatten sehr schöne Straßenverhältnisse mit Baumbewuchs, mit Alleen, sodass man sich auch am Tage bewegen konnte. Man war gegen Luftangriffe zumindest geschützt oder schien geschützt zu sein. Man konnte nicht so leicht entdeckt werden.
But on the night of the 16th of September, British and American bombers struck German airfields and anti-aircraft positions across the Netherlands. At 9:45 a.m. the next day, thousands of aircraft of the 1st Airborne Army took off from their bases in England and set course for their drop zones. The vast air armada formed up in 2 columns, 3 miles across and a staggering 94 miles long.
There were planes still taking off in England while men were dropping in Holland. That's how vast it was. You could actually step over from one plane to another all the way across the channel to Holland from England.
Johnny Peters was in one of the leading British gliders, with clear views ahead.
Right, when we went over the North Sea, we could see the air sea rescue boats in there, our channel men, so it was very reassuring to see these air sea rescue boats in case we ditched in the sea. It was a beautiful flight. Blazing sun, a huge convoy, about 3 miles wide, all full of planes. Extraordinary sight, wonderful sight.
One of the largest gliders taking part in Market Garden was the Airspeed Horsa. A British design built mostly of spruce and plywood, its prefabricated sections were often put together by furniture makers. The Horsa carried 2 pilots and 25 troops, or loads such as a jeep or a small anti-tank gun. Allied gliders were towed towards the landing zone by transport aircraft or bombers, then released to glide silently down towards their target. Although they weren't guaranteed a smooth landing, gliders did an excellent job of dropping a unit onto its target without scattering them, as often happened in parachute drops. As the first wave of Operation Market reached the Netherlands, they discovered that plenty of German anti-aircraft guns had survived the previous night's raid by Allied bombers.
The AK gunners fired in the front of us. Shortly afterwards, a cry went up from the back of the glider, the tail's coming off. Now, this was relayed from the back to the front. I was sitting in the front behind the pilots, and my sergeant was sitting opposite, and he relayed that back to the pilot. He sent Ralph Maltby to have a look. He came back, big grin on his face, say, "You're all right. The fabric's being hit. It's only flapping about, but the tail's not coming off." So he sat down. We were very reassured about that.
It was a narrow escape for everyone on board. But as Johnny Peters' glider approached the landing zone, they came under more fire, and the co-pilot was hit.
I knew he died by the look on Sergeant Watson's face. Then you think to yourself, well, what would happen if the pilot get killed? None of us could pilot the glider. The German machine gunners were firing their bullets, and they were coming through the glider, and only one bullet hit a bloke named Private Hughes in the leg, but he made a good landing.
In most landing zones, German air defences were light and caught off guard. Most gliders touched down safely in open farmland. The parachute drops went almost exactly according to plan. Of the 1,000 transport aircraft used on the first day, just 27 were destroyed.
We weren't under fire at all coming in. It was really nice. It was on a Sunday afternoon, about 1 o'clock. Sun was shining, and it was an ideal type of operation, I call it.
The British 1st Airborne Division landed 6 to 8 miles northwest of Arnhem with near total surprise.
It was a perfect summer's day. We landed with no opposition at all.
The US 82nd Airborne, landing near Nijmegen, were immediately welcomed by Dutch locals.
While we were picking up our equipment, all the Dutch civilians were coming out of the tree line, and they're all speaking perfect English. And I said to my buddy, are we still in England or is this Holland? They spoke perfect English. They wanted to tell us where the Germans were, and we wanted to get them off the landing zone so they wouldn't get hit.
Meanwhile, the US 101st Airborne landed further south, near Eindhoven. Second Lieutenant Frank Gregg received a less friendly reception.
I landed and right on the drop zone, and it was filled with big Holstein cows, milk cows. And they panicked, of course, when all these parachutes started coming down. And I'm thinking, oh man, I'd hate to have to write home from the hospital that I was severely wounded by a big Holstein cow or something like that, or even killed by one, because they were really running around in the pasture.
The US airborne troops quickly took control of the road between Eindhoven and Nijmegen. The Netherlands had been under Nazi occupation for 4 years, but the arrival of the Allied forces came as a huge delight for its citizens, especially for members of one of the best organized resistance groups in Europe.
I got all my troops to the bridge, and about the time I got my foot on one end of the bridge, a Dutchman and a very pretty girl stepped on the other end. They were in a black leather coats like the Germans wore, and both carrying submachine guns slung over their shoulders. And I said, I'm not sure these people are friendly. So anyway, the girl came bursting over toward me and said, we are from the Dutch underground, and we are here to help you in any way you need help. I thanked her and so forth. She gave me a briefing on that there were no enemy in town. It was clear of Germans.
The airborne part of the operation had started well. Most troops had landed on or close to their intended drop zone. Now they needed to secure the vital bridges along 30th Corps' route to the Rhine. But the Allies didn't have it all their own way. A dash to the Arnhem Bridge by British paratroopers in jeeps hit a German roadblock. Most were killed or captured. The Paras would have to reach the bridge on foot, but it would be a hard slog.
One of the first mistakes that Browning made, he dropped us 7 miles from the bridge, and we were all carrying about 80 pounds worth of equipment and weapons. You can't run all the way. Merely walking take about 4 hours.
Problems were developing elsewhere too. North of Eindhoven, German engineers and Luftwaffe trainees blew up bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal before US paratroopers could reach them. 30 miles northeast at Nijmegen, more bridges across the Maas-Waal Canal were blown before the 82nd Airborne got to them. Back in Arnhem, British 1st Airborne was about to run into the SS Panzer units that Major Urquhart had tried to warn of. Fortunately, they were well below full strength.
One of the legends, shall we say, about Operation Market Garden was that 1st British Airborne Division, which dropped at Arnhem, was dropping on top of 2 SS armoured divisions, 2 SS Panzer divisions. That is true in the sense that 9th and 10th SS Panzer Division were in the area, but they had been so badly destroyed in the Battle of Normandy and the subsequent retreat They were really only as strong as what the Germans called Kampfgruppe, that is to say, something about the size of a weak division with not too many tanks. But even in those terms, the Allies were taking a risk which really only made sense if the Germans weren't going to fight. And they did.
Another surprise for British 1st Airborne was that they'd landed almost on top of German Army Group B headquarters, from where Field Marshal Model would orchestrate a rapid German response. Model was Germany's youngest field marshal, and greatly admired by Hitler and other senior commanders for his performance on the Eastern Front. He had been nicknamed the Führer's fireman for his ability to salvage apparently disastrous situations, even when his forces were heavily outnumbered.
The fact that he is a completely driven, also committed soldier are summed up by many accounts that we see, that he was very tough and very hard against his own troops, because he really wanted to achieve things, but also very hard and tough against himself, and for that the people admired and respected him.
As German commanders planned their response to the landings, they were handed a gift. In the wreckage of a crashed Allied glider, German troops found a complete set of orders for Operation Market Garden. Model saw that if he could hold the Allies at Nijmegen, the British paratroopers at Arnhem would remain cut off, and the Allied operation would fail. He split 2nd SS Panzer Corps into Kampfgruppe, or battle groups. Kampfgruppe Hohenstaufen was to hold Arnhem and its bridge against the British, while Kampfgruppe Frundsberg raced south over Arnhem Bridge to prevent the Allies crossing at Nijmegen.
The concept of Battlegroup or Kampfgruppe in German is a very specific concept that you could find in the German army in the Second World War. The idea was that whenever the need arose, you would form ad hoc formations out of existing formations, quite often of broken up formations or formations that already received or taken a lot of casualties, and form a new fighting body out of these.
Improvised Kampfgruppen helped Germany make the most of its dwindling military strength and respond rapidly to new threats.
Ihr geht da runter, ihr müsst euch beeilen, kämpft alles nieder, was sich euch im Weg stellt, und ihr müsst dann alle zusammen mit den anderen, die dort ankommen, einen Kessel bilden.
The swift German response meant Allied airborne troops were soon engaged in heavy fighting. At 2:35 p.m, the Allied ground attack began. Tanks of British 30th Corps crossed the Dutch-Belgian border on the road to Arnhem. Working to a strict timetable, they needed to reach Eindhoven by the end of the day, but the single road through open country was highly exposed. Within 10 minutes, they were hit by a German ambush and lost several tanks.
We were being fired on from the flanks as we pushed up the road. I don't know if you know Holland, but it was then just a series of country roads. There was nowhere to go. The tank wouldn't go off the road, he'd sink, because Holland was built on water.
You travelled on dike roads most of the time. And travelling on dike roads in the dark and the wet is not very comfortable at times.
With air support from Typhoon fighter bombers, the British tanks pushed on, along what soon became known as Hell's Highway. 30th Corps only managed to advance 5 miles on the first day, failing to reach Eindhoven, which remained in German hands. Just 24 hours into the operation, and Market Garden was already behind schedule. Allied airborne units were now in heavy fighting for a series of bridges that 30th Corps would need for their advance through the Netherlands into Germany itself. The 101st Airborne Division had successfully captured the crossings at Eindhoven. The 82nd, tasked with capturing the bridges at Nijmegen, were just south of their objective, at Grave. But at Arnhem, British 1st Airborne was in trouble. About 5,000 men were scattered west of town, in heavy fighting with local German forces, as well as the Waffen-SS troops. Only around 300 men had managed to reach their objective, the Arnhem Road Bridge, and were now dug in at its northern end, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost. John Frost was an experienced officer and one of the first to join the newly formed Parachute Regiment in 1941. He'd led daring missions into German-held territory before, including the successful Bruneval raid on the coast of occupied France to steal top-secret German radar equipment. Now he was in command of the tiny force of British paratroopers who had got through to the objective. As night fell, John Frost radioed divisional headquarters that they had secured the northern end of the bridge. He was ordered to hold his position until 30th Corps reached him. Around 9 p.m, Frost was reinforced by a group led by Major Tony Hibbert.
We had been ordered in the brigade orders that our job was to capture Arnhem Bridge and hold it for 48 hours until we were relieved from the south. Well, we'd actually done the job. We'd captured the bridge. We held the north end of it, which was the only bit that was necessary.
On day 2 of the operation, Frost's small force remained dug in around the north end of Arnhem Bridge, cut off from the rest of their division.
There were about nearly 600 chaps at John Frost's disposal, and he disposed them into a tight perimeter, but he could only go so far as he had chaps.
Then the paratroopers heard the sound of vehicles approaching from the south. It must be 30th Corps come to relieve them.
We thought that the tanks were in fact our own tanks coming from the south, the ones that were actually going to relieve us. And it was quite extraordinary. We had, as I say, about 160 people on the bridge, and they all took off their helmets and put their berets on and came out to cheer them forward. And of course, it wasn't until they came up to the top of the bridge that we saw that they'd got the wrong insignia on.
The vehicles belonged to an SS reconnaissance unit. When they realized the bridge was in British hands, they tried to rush it. But the paratroopers were ready.
And you could see the fear on their face, what they were running into. We had 3 para under there, and they opened up and they killed all those people that charged over the bridge.
The German column was wiped out in a barrage of fire from small arms, anti-tank guns, and the British Army's unique anti-tank weapon, the Piat.
For the first 2 years of the Second World War, the British had a really ineffective anti-tank rifle. But in August 1942, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, or Piat, was introduced. It's an unusual-looking weapon and very cumbersome. It's very heavy. It's about 15 kilograms in weight. It was really important that you got very, very close to the target. Ideally, if you're trying to knock out a tank, you want to be to the side of it, on its flank, or even better, behind it. You'd then sight it using this very simple upright foresight. So you'd pull the trigger, the spring would shoot forward, hit the detonator at the back of the bomb flies forward, the detonator would then recock the spring, ready for the next round to be put in it. One of the problems with it was that the tail end of the bomb was hollow, so it acted like a rifle barrel, so as it exploded, it would then fire the remains of the detonator straight back towards the Piat operator, so you'd have to duck out the way as soon as you'd fired. They were incredibly effective. There were some unit commanders that said that this was the most effective weapon that their section carried. It was also successful. There were more tanks knocked out with Piats than there were by rocket-firing Typhoons and Tempests.
On day 2, major British airborne reinforcements set off from England after a 4-hour delay due to morning mist. This second wave had no element of surprise, and as they approached the landing zone west of Arnhem, they came under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Bill Higgs was one of the glider pilots.
The Jerrys have already sized out where we're going to land them, because the landing ground was a big open space, you see, miles, and of course the Germans soon surrounded it with their guns, and they were knocking them out in the air and as I was flying over, you could see a puff there, a puff there, a puff there.
Ich will nicht sagen, das war wie Tontaubenschießen, das wäre jetzt falsch ausgedrückt. Aber zuerst konnten wir das gar nicht begreifen, dass die das noch vorhaben da.
Not only were the British under fire on the way in, but on the ground they found the Germans already attacking the landing zones themselves.
They were all around and they were really knocking us for six. But I got down by these trees and I thought I can get in by the trees. If I can get to the trees, I haven't got far to run, you see. So.
The surviving reinforcements gradually assembled, ready to move out. But there was another problem. The commander of British 1st Airborne Division, Major General Urquhart, had landed on day one, but was now missing in Arnhem, which was swarming with German troops. To make matters worse, British radios weren't working. Frost's men at the bridge couldn't reach division headquarters just 3.5 miles away, or Corps HQ near Nijmegen.
When we got there, the signals didn't work, so that was a waste for a start.
I felt that because I couldn't even talk to my men, that I wasn't doing my job.
One of the things that caused Market Garden to go wrong almost immediately was the complete chaos and lack of communication in most of the drop zones. Especially around Arnhem, the paratroopers had been scattered so widely and so far away from their targets that they had little idea of where they were or what to do. In addition, their radios proved not to work all that effectively, and so they couldn't even talk to each other and figure out what was going on.
By the time of the Market Garden operation, the radio sets that were taken to Arnhem, there were 4 different types, and the set that was used between the companies and battalion was the wireless set 68. And that was very, very similar to this 18 set, which was the standard infantry radio set. It had links of copper aerial that slotted together. Wireless operators always used to say it was like having an enormous neon sign above you, this huge great aerial waving around telling the enemy where you were, which wasn't very popular. There were many problems with the radio communications at Arnhem, and a lot of those were known about before they set off. The whole thing was a gamble, and they gambled on the fact that radio equipment, which really wasn't quite up to the job, would just about do the job. They gambled on the fact that they'd got enough radio operators because inevitably, being an airborne operation, they'd cut down on the amount of people that they could take with them. And the problem with that, of course, is that once radio operators started becoming casualties and were killed and wounded, there were no trained operators to replace them. Some of the radios had batteries which were disposable, and obviously the problem with that is resupply in the middle of a combat zone. Other radios had rechargeable batteries, and again, in a combat zone, that was a very tricky thing to do, to gather radio batteries, get them back to a place where they could be recharged. But the big problem was procedure. In a lot of instances, they simply didn't follow the agreed procedure. The whole division changed their frequency for the radios. But by that stage, the divisional headquarters were already out of contact with the brigade that was trying to get through to Arnhem Bridge. So when they changed their frequency, there wasn't a hope of getting back in contact with them because they'd got no idea that the frequency had been changed.
Tony Hibbert set up 8 large wireless sets at his headquarters near the bridge.
But the problem was that they had been set up really for work in the open. And from the moment we reached Arnhem, we were out of touch.
While Frost and his men remained cut off at the north end of Arnhem Bridge, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division battled to reach them, in vain. The casualties were starting to mount.
You know, you was in for a fight. No two ways about it. And the Germans knew that they were reinforcing quicker than what we were. Our medics were filling up. Now and again, the general would say, Bloisy, go and see what the check is, you know, and you go in. Sometimes you shout to them and they'd give you by signs, you know, numbers. And that sometimes you went in there and these chaps be laying all around the wall, you couldn't get any more in there.
Meanwhile, 40 miles southwest of Arnhem, 30th Corps had reached their first objective, the Dutch city of Eindhoven. and linked up with the US 101st Airborne. Jubilant Dutch civilians cheered the British tanks as they passed through, half a day behind schedule. Their next objective was Nijmegen, but the city and its bridge were still in German hands.
When we got to Nijmegen, the Grenadier Guards in Shermans were in the lead, but when they got there, the American paratroopers had not captured the bridge, which meant they had to fight for the bridge.
An attack on the bridge would mean more crucial hours lost, but there was no other option. On day 3, a combined assault by British tanks, infantry, and US paratroopers attempted to seize Nijmegen and its bridge, but ran into fierce German resistance. The attack failed. Back in Arnhem, Lieutenant General Urquhart had managed to rejoin his division, but breaking through to John Frost's men at the north end of the bridge looked increasingly unlikely. The rest of the division was now surrounded in the western suburb of Oosterbeek, struggling to hold its own position. Colonel Frost's force, just a few hundred strong, clung on desperately at the bridge as German attacks intensified.
We're doing very well for the first 3 or 4 hours. And then, of course, the Germans put their artillery units on the other side of the river. And from that moment onwards, we were under a continual artillery attack. And on the next day, they started to bring up their tanks.
As the battle at the bridge became increasingly one-sided, the Germans sent a captured British engineer back to Frost's men with a message.
This engineer has come back over the bridge waving a big piece of white, waving it away, and he said, "Oh, the Germans want to surrender, sir." So he said, "Well, tell them to do it properly. I want 2 officers with a white sheet to come over and with no arms." "No, sir," he said, "I didn't mean it that way." He said, "I meant they want you to surrender." He said, "Tell them to sod off." So he said, "Do you want me to go back?" He said, "Do you want to go back?" He said, "No, I don't."
For all Frost's determination to fight on at Arnhem, his fate and the fate of his men rested with Allied forces 10 miles to the south at Nijmegen, where the bridge remained in German hands. But the commander of the 82nd Airborne had come up with a plan. Brigadier General James Gavin had been decorated for his role in the invasion of Sicily in 1943, made the night jump into Normandy on D-Day, and just 6 weeks before Market Garden was given command of the elite 82nd Airborne. He was an admired and charismatic leader who insisted that his officers be the first out of the airplane door and the last in the chow line. Faced with stubborn German resistance, Gavin proposed to have the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment cross the Vaal 2 miles downriver, so they could then launch an attack on the bridge from both ends. The crossing had to be made in collapsible wood and canvas boats under heavy enemy fire. Half the soldiers in the first wave were either killed or wounded. But with men across the river, the Allies could launch their simultaneous attack on both ends of the bridge. The Germans tried to blow the bridge, but the explosives failed and the surviving defenders fled. The road to Arnhem was open, but the Allied advance along Hell's Highway had been long and arduous, and they were now 30 hours behind schedule. Operation Market Garden's all-important timetable was in tatters. Ray Cumley was driving one of the Welsh Guards' Cromwell tanks, frustrated by their slow advance.
As we crossed, it was almost dusk, and we knocked 2 German tanks out at that. But then we were at standstill overnight because we advanced the next day. And of course, when we advanced, we couldn't do it. And of course, the Airborne were being closed in by the SS. There was no chance for them.
And we were determined if only we could get there, but we couldn't.
At Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel Frost and his dwindling band of paratroopers still clung on to the north end of the bridge. But as each hour passed, more German reinforcements arrived in Arnhem, and they were now under sustained attack from German artillery, infantry, and armour.
The Germans, having dealt with other pockets of resistance, are now able to regroup their forces and, together with tank support, including Tiger tanks, to launch the last and final attack onto the bridge, and quite quickly they then managed to overrun the British positions, merely because the British are running out of ammunition and supplies, and because a normal paratrooper unit is not equipped to deal with German Tiger tanks.
On the 20th of September, after holding the bridge for 4 days and 5 nights, Frost's men learned that there was no hope of them being relieved as planned. They requested a ceasefire to help with their enormous number of casualties. Brigade Major Tony Hibbert was an eyewitness to the grim scenes.
We had over 300 wounded in the hospital, and the building was on fire, and the flames were out of control. So we had to ask the Germans not only for the ceasefire, but for them to send us some of their men to help us get wounded out. That took about 2 hours, and at the end of that time, the Germans had infiltrated the perimeter that we'd been defending.
With no ammunition left, Frost's men began to surrender. But some decided to try and rejoin the rest of the division, holed up in Oosterbeek, 2 miles west.
There was no point in trying to defend the bridge, so I split them up into parties of 10 to try and make their way back to the main perimeter in Oosterbeek. But there were too many Germans. Wherever we went, we ran into Germans, and we were all taken prisoner.
During the truce, the German commander sought out his British counterpart.
Colonel Frost. He'd been badly wounded on the second day, still able to talk. The German commander came up and said, Colonel Frost, I salute you. We've just come back from Russia, where they'd been fighting for 2 years. He said, I've never seen any people as brave as yours. I salute you. That was nice.
But the courage and tenacity with which Frost and his men had held their ground had not been enough. Arnhem had proved a bridge too far. The 21st of September, day 5. With Frost's command eliminated, Arnhem Bridge was back in German hands. The rest of the 1st Airborne Division were dug in around Oosterbeek, on the wrong side of the river from British and American forces pushing up from Nijmegen. But 30th Corps' progress along Hell's Highway remained painfully slow, and now British tanks were taking fire from one of Germany's most lethal weapons.
You were sitting ducks, as you might say, because the 88mm guns, these were the anti-tank the German had. I think it was the finest gun ever for tank warfare in particular.
Facing the British armour attack is a very strong German defence in depth. They've got weapons like the famous PaK-43 anti-tank gun. That's one of these ones here behind me. It's an 88mm gun, and it can fire a solid shot armour-piercing round that would penetrate one of the British Sherman tanks out to about 2.5 kilometres away. So you have the situation that British tanks are being knocked out
and they can't even see the enemy that is firing at them.
Each time a German anti-tank gun picked off the lead British tank, the rest of the column was stuck behind it on the single road until the destroyed vehicle could be cleared. Corps Commander Lieutenant General Horrocks ordered his infantry forward, but they too ran into fierce German resistance.
We were desperate to relieve the airborne at Arnhem. The Germans were equally determined that we would not reach them, that they would surrender before we had a chance to cross the River Rhine and get back to them, get them out. And so it was a battle of attrition for 4 or 5 days.
30th Corps was running out of time. At Oosterbeek, the British Airborne were critically low on ammunition and water. Attempts to resupply them by air were only partly successful, with most canisters falling behind German lines. And they remained under relentless attack from all sides.
We knew we were losing the battle because we get pulled into a perimeter, getting smaller and smaller, so we knew we weren't going to win it.
30th Corps began looking for alternative ways to reach the airborne troops at Oosterbeek. Their reconnaissance units, using small country lanes, found a route to the river that bypassed the main German defences, and at Driel made contact with the 1st Polish Parachute Brigade, who'd been dropped as reinforcements on day 3. Over the next few days, 30th Corps made several attempts to cross the river and link up with the Paras.
We sent a company of our 4th Dorsets across the river to form a bridge at the other side, so then when the paratroopers were coming back, they knew where they'd get across.
But as airborne resistance north of the river began to collapse, any reinforcements who made it across risked sharing their fate.
I think they sent a whole company across, and not many of them came back. They didn't all get killed, but they got captured.
It was increasingly clear that Operation Market Garden had failed. The British priority became rescuing as many airborne troops as possible from the far shore of the Rhine.
The real issue on the ground at the time was, were the Germans about to overrun 1st Airborne Division's positions with perhaps a resulting massacre? The British knew there were SS troops involved. They were afraid there might be a massacre. In fact, there wasn't. The Waffen-SS troops were generally so impressed with the way that the paratroopers and glider troops had fought that they treated them rather well. But again, in the big picture, it wasn't just about getting across and into Arnhem. It was about getting much further north into Holland with substantial forces. And that clearly was not going to happen at this stage. So the decision is taken to withdraw those forces across the Rhine, rather perhaps sarcastically entitled Operation Berlin.
The word came through, they were going to pull out at 11 o'clock at night, but don't tell these Dutch people because we think they're pro-German because they live near the border of Germany, and so don't tell them we're pulling out in case they tell the Germans, you know. So we were in this trench, and they were all across the river. The Royal Artillery were firing 2 guns on the extreme right and left. Each one was a tracer, so we were told keep within them tracers, you know, otherwise the shell outside there. And we got to the river, the church, across the river, and now that was horrendous there. The Germans knew we were getting out. Apparently, they thought at first the Poles were coming in across the river, but then realised we were getting out. So they shelled this place. That was the worst night of my life, and I have nightmares about that. Many.
They managed to get about 2,400 Allied troops across the Rhine that particular night, which practically ends the fighting in the Arnhem area. and the Germans, of course, claimed this as their victory.
The Battle of Arnhem ended amid death and chaos and a humiliating British retreat. The recriminations began almost immediately.
I felt ashamed that, being English, that we was losing the battle through incompetence.
The British performed poorly because they didn't listen. They were good soldiers. They were brave. But the command, they were crazy. Dropping those people over there, knowing the German armor was over there. Dutch people told them, and the British insisted that they were wrong.
Characteristically, Montgomery refused to accept any blame.
Montgomery was an extremely capable commander with a massive ego who had the habit, particularly after the war, of saying that he could pre-plan all his battles perfectly and the enemy never had any say in it. He just carried out his master plan. He also said he never lost a battle. When asked about Market Garden, it was claimed it was a 90% success. That was very typical of the man.
Monty's master plan had not got the Allies across the Rhine and into Germany as promised, and the war would not be over by Christmas. Instead, Eisenhower's broad front strategy would resume once the Allies had resolved their supply crisis, a crisis that had only been exacerbated by Operation Market Garden.
Market Garden drew substantial amount of supplies away from other areas of the Allied front. Most importantly, the Southern American armies, like Patton's Third Army, were starved of fuel and had to slow their advance as a result. Market Garden also distracted Montgomery from other important areas of his responsibility. Most importantly, although the port city of Antwerp was captured, Montgomery neglected to capture the areas leading into the port. The Germans controlled the estuary between Antwerp and the sea, and that meant that the Allies couldn't start using the Antwerp port to bring supplies in for much longer time than they should have.
Operation Market Garden was one of the war's great what-ifs. A chance to shorten the war and so save many thousands of lives, squandered through poor planning, and in spite of the heroism and skill of many who took part.
We jumped 17 September, and we were relieved by the Canadians on the 11th of November. We just sat there facing Germany. Just sat there, because it was a, as you British say, it was a cock-up. It was a cock-up. It was a mess, really.